Good morning, everybody. So I'm just checking the screen here to see the people arriving. So we're just on, I think, about 10:30, maybe a minute or so after. So I'll maybe give a second or two just for some others to join. I'll give them a minute, but I'll not leave it too long because I'm conscious of all of your time and the importance of getting this webinar started and finished on time. Hope you're all well this morning. Not sure what the weather's like where you are, but it's pretty grim where I am. But if I'm looking at the forecast, it's going to stay grim for a while, so I think we're going to have to get used to it. Okay, still some people joining us here, so I'll just give it another few seconds and then we'll make a start. Okay. I think we'll go ahead now with the webinar. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining me this morning. This morning's topic is managing risk and the essentials for voluntary boards. So this webinar is the second in a series of free webinars that I'm running for charity boards and other not-for-profit boards as well. And the purpose of them is really to try to give everybody a bite-sized chunk of knowledge on important topics. So really what I've decided to do is condense some quite heavy bits of information into something a little bit more practical. I know myself when I used to go on training programs and various events, some of it was heavy, some of it was light, but I always wanted to go away with something that was very tangible and something that I could take back and apply to my work environment. So that's the purpose of these webinars, just to make sure that there's something that you can take away practically. So this is the second webinar, as I say. It's a live webinar. I know that some are recorded. I've decided to do the first couple live at least. I may decide to record some webinars in the future and make those available to people to watch at their own leisure, because I know it's sometimes difficult to free up the time during the day, and even if you put it in your diary, things come along and it gets moved or you can't attend. So some of the future webinars may well be recorded, and I'll keep you posted about that. Some of the topics for the future webinars are effective meetings. So effective meetings in voluntary organizations, because most members of the board are, if not all, are volunteers, and time is important. So I've spent some time, I'll share that with you in a second or two. I've spent some time on charity boards, and I know the importance of making sure the time is well spent. So the future topics will be effective meetings and also effective boards. So I think effective boards is something that really a lot of boards need to consider. Every board likes to think that they're effective, but not every board is effective. And some of the work that I've been doing recently is on helping boards to self-diagnose their effectiveness. Boards should really be assessing their effectiveness on an annual basis. They recommend that you get an external evaluation done every 3 years, but you should do an internal evaluation every year. So I'll be spending some time on a future webinar talking about how boards can go about that process. And financial management, a really important part of any organization, never mind a not-for-profit organization, but financial management is really important and a key area for most organizations. So I'll be talking a little bit about how to improve financial management oversight and manage the whole financial piece within a not-for-profit organization. If you want to keep abreast of what is happening, you can subscribe to the channel once I send the link, because I mean these videos are going to be recorded. You'll get a chance to look at them. There will be an opportunity as well during this here to ask some questions, and there will be an opportunity as well to put in some chat on the chat room there. So I'll do my best to try to look at those questions as we're going through this, but that might be difficult. So I may leave the questions until the end. So if you want to keep abreast of what the future webinars will be, you can subscribe to the Add More Business YouTube channel. You can sign up to the newsletter on the website, or you can follow me on Twitter. All the details will be on that. It's at Add More Business. Or you can send a link to me on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, more than happy to link up with you after this year if you believe that's appropriate, because I'll be posting some stuff on LinkedIn, and I'll be doing a series of blogs as well on these related topics. So a little bit about me. For those who don't know me, my name is Tony Harron. I own Admore Business Solutions, and you'll see just a little summary of my background there. But I have been a charity trustee. I was on a charity board for almost 10 years. And I also worked on a credit union as a member of their supervisory committee. It's also a volunteer role. And in that role, I looked at things like corporate governance and finance and board effectiveness, etc. And so I've had quite a bit of experience working as a volunteer in those roles, but I've also worked with boards as well in a private capacity. My background is in finance. I'm an accountant by profession, worked in banking for a long time, and I worked in a couple of risk functions there. So I worked in credit risk, a credit risk function, and investment risk as well. So I've experience of working in a risk environment. And so this topic is actually quite close to my own heart. This is something that I believe that boards probably underestimate, maybe undervalue, and maybe misunderstand a little bit. So I'm going to try and take you through the process, I think, for a board to evaluate how good you are at managing risk. So today we're going to look at what is risk, how do you identify your own risks, and that's quite important, because identifying your own risks is the starting point for all of this here, to understand what actual risks your organization faces. And it's only when you understand what those risks are that you can begin to understand how you're going to actually deal with those risks, how you're going to manage those risks. So we're going to look at how you manage those, and we're going to look at the process for that. We're going to make sure that you've got an understanding of the process, procedures that sit around risk management in your organization. I'm also going to look at how you embed risk management in your organization. Now, that is actually, that's probably a topic on its own, if I'm being honest, because embedding risk in an organization is where I think many boards have difficulties. A lot of them have the elements of risk management within the organization, but embedding risk into their functions, into their systems, into their processes, I think many boards struggle a little bit with that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of how a board can approach that and how a board can manage to do that. I'm also going to talk about where risk management fits in the overall governance or overall structure and framework of an effective board, because risk management is a standalone topic, and I'm treating it as a standalone topic today. And the first webinar that I did was on conflicts of interest, and it was also treated as a standalone topic. But in reality, when you're looking at any of these issues around governance or effective boards, it's really important that you understand that there's a bigger context, and where does these issues sit within that bigger context? Because treating each of these as standalone individual items doesn't lend itself to becoming an effective board. You've got to blend and manage these issues and these topics and pull them together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you and your board can actually approach that. And how I'm going to do that? I'm going to do that by looking at the essentials under 7 separate headings. So again, the purpose of today is about trying to give you some bite-sized pieces, some key things you can take away. Because I could have done this webinar on a whole series of theoretical issues around risk management and processes and procedures. But if you're anything like me, when you sit on a board, it's some things you want to look at, practical things that you could take and you could manage it. And if you're not on the board yourself, if you're working for the board or to the board, you also want to be able to understand how to make the whole risk management process easier within the organization and across the organization. So I'm going to take you through each of the 7 essentials. Now, what I would like to do, just checking, making sure we're okay. I think more people in now. So when I'm going through the 7 essentials, I recognize that each of you in your organizations, or you and your organizations, could well be in different places on the risk journey. You may well be starting out with very little information. You may well be starting out with very little information on risk and how to manage it, or you may be quite sophisticated. You may have quite intricate risk management systems already in place, but you're still here to maybe just make sure that you're not missing things. But what I'd like you to do is benchmark you and your organization against the essentials that I'm going to go through. And you may find that some of them are already in place. You maybe feel that you're doing it differently, and you may feel that some of the things that I'm talking about maybe wouldn't work in your organization. But let me reassure you that the issues that I'm going to talk about are fundamental to any not-for-profit organization. So even if you're not in a charitable organization, if you're in a credit union or a sports body or some other organization that's a not-for-profit, most of what I'm going to talk about today will be just as relevant to you. So the point is, when I'm going through the essentials, look at each one and decide where you are against that as a benchmark. You and your organization are. Okay, I'm going to start off with a quick poll here. This is just a quick question. I'm just going to ask each of you. I'm just going to pop it up on the screen in a moment. So it's really a question. I just want to understand that those who are on this webinar, how many of you actually have a risk policy in place? I suspect it probably is most of you, but some may not have one in place. And I just want to get an understanding of where you are on that. So I'm just going to pop that up now. Okay. Okay, so the question is, does your organization have an up-to-date risk policy? Yes or no? There's, I think, I don't know, and I'm not applicable, because I understand there may be some on the webinar who are maybe advisors who maybe aren't actually on a charity board themselves. So I've left the not applicable in there if that's the case. Okay, we've got most participating who've answered. Some haven't answered. That's okay. Okay, in terms of percentage, yes, okay. I'll end the call. We've got 50% of you say you have a policy, that you have one in place at the moment. 17% of you don't have a policy in place, and 33% of you, so a third, don't know actually whether you have a policy in place or not, which is interesting in itself. So that's actually an important question just to start off. So really that's allowing me to put into context where a number of you are, and I appreciate some maybe haven't answered that. There's a slight change in that. We have 43% do, 29% don't, and an equal 29% aren't sure or don't know. So, okay, that's fine. Whether you have or haven't got a policy in place, that's fine. The purpose, I'm sure, you're coming along today is maybe to understand that. So I'm going to be talking about that and the importance of having a policy, because a risk policy underpins everything that I'm talking about. So a risk policy will really be really important for you to develop one. So we'll talk about that, and I'll go through, that'll be one of the essentials. Okay, so we're now going to talk about what is risk. So a very simple definition. I try to keep things as simple as I can, just for my own understanding. But this definition from Cambridge Dictionary, in simple terms, risk is the possibility of something bad happening. So really, it's in simple terms, a risk is a concern or an event that would go wrong and cause a problem for your organization. So really important that you are aware of what a risk is and what you need to do about it. And not all risks need to be eliminated or avoided, and I talk about the different responses to risk. But it's important just to understand what a risk is, and not only what a risk is, but what the risks are that are specific to your organization. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So risk management is, and this is from the risk management standard, the ISO 31000. So there's a risk standard for an ISO standard for risk management, and you can look it up. You can Google it, and you can go through whatever search engine you use. You can go through and understand what's in a good risk management process. And if you like, you can consider adopting the 31000 ISO. And bring it into your organization if you want to bring it to that level. But today we're talking about the basics and making sure you've got all the fundamentals in place. Because I'm aware that some of the organizations that are on the line today and on the webinar today are smallish organizations, and others are quite large organizations. So the needs of those organizations are different. The fundamentals of risk management will be the same for all the organizations, and no organization, certainly no not-for-profit or charitable organization, is allowed to ignore risk. It's on the Charity Commission website, details of it. I'll talk a little bit about that, about what they say about this. So really important that you understand where you are on the scale, as in small, medium, large, but I talk about the different sizes as well in terms of what's important for you. So basically the ISO identifies risk management as coordinated activities to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. So risk management, as you would imagine, is the management of risk. It's about how do you identify risk, how do you manage risk, how do you control it, how do you communicate it, how does it affect your business, your organization, your processes, your procedures. So all of those things are what risk management is about. And I always put this in here when I'm talking about risk. People correlate risk and return. As we all know, even from investment perspectives, the higher the risk you take tends to be the higher return you can expect to get. The lower the risk you take, the lower the return you would expect to get on that. So I always use the analogy of an organization or an individual with £1 million. Good luck to them in the bank, and if that's in the bank account and it's with a recognized bank that's regulated, etc., the risk of something happening to that money or that cash, virtually nil. I wouldn't say absolutely nil, but certainly virtually nil. Very, very low. But the return on that will be very low. The interest rates at the moment probably sub 0.25%. In fact, I think in some cases a negative interest rate. So the risk would be very, very low, that you might lose that money, but the return would be very low as well. And equally, if you took all that money and you put it into the stock market, anything from FTSE 100 shares up to hedge funds, et cetera, the higher the risk you take, the more likely the higher return you get. So risk and return, there's that correlation. I'm not going to get into return on this webinar, really. I'm just talking about it in the context of understanding that it's important that you, as an organization, realize that risks exist. They will be there. There's nothing you can do about them, in the sense that there will always be risks. The only thing you can do about them is to internalize them and bring them under some sort of control or mitigate against it. And I'll talk about the mitigation techniques as we go through this. So a little bit from the Charity Commission website. And again, if there's any organizations who aren't regulated charities or charities registered, maybe credit unions or whatever, the issues that and the quotations that I'm using from the Charity Commission website are actually all equally applicable to your organization, because credit unions are regulated by the PRA in the UK and by the Central Bank of Ireland in the Republic of Ireland. So, but if you go onto their websites, you will find similar definitions of risk and the need to manage it, etc. So what I'm talking about here is about charities, but the background, the issues are fundamentally the same for any organization that's a not-for-profit organization. So the Charity Commission says that charity trustees should regularly review and assess the risks faced by their charity in all areas of its work and plan for the management of those risks. So a very clear statement from the Charity Commission that risk management is something that a trustee and a board must do. There's no equivocation there. They are required to do that by regulation. And they go on to say that risk is an everyday part of charitable activity, and managing it effectively is essential if the trustees are to achieve their key objectives and safeguard the charity's funds and assets. So I've underlined a few different words in there. I've underlined the word every day in that second paragraph, you can see. So every day means that the Charity Commission recognises that risks are here, that every organisation will face them, and it's important that you then have a process to manage those risks. Now, when I'm going to be talking about over the next period of time, we've got 50 minutes or so left, 40 minutes, sorry, left. I'm going to be talking about a process for managing risk, but the Charity Commission doesn't define how you should manage risk and how you should record and manage and control risk. They just say you need to have a system for doing it. And again, because some organizations on the webinar or individuals from organizations are on the smaller side and some are on the larger side, the process for managing the risks will be different. Smaller organizations can have it much more simple as long as it's effective. Larger organizations maybe need a little bit more complexity because it also needs to be effective. So Charity Commission also go on to talk about the risk framework and what it should allow you to do. And there's 3. Memory. So identify the major risks that apply to your charity. That's the first one. Make decisions about how to respond to the risks that you face. So it's not just we know what our risks are and at least we're aware of them. That's step 1. You've got to actually then think about that and decide, well, how are you going to respond to that? And how are you going to manage those risks and how are you going to control those risks? And make an appropriate statement regarding risk management in your annual report. So some charities are obligated based on their size to produce an annual report. Other smaller charities aren't necessarily expected to do that, but the Charity Commission still certainly recommends, it is compulsory for those who have a full annual report to put in a statement about risk management. And they also recommend that smaller charities do that as best practice. So risk is up front. I know recently in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, there was a major announcement from the regulators down there in relation to credit unions. And they put out a statement that they felt that most credit union boards were struggling with the concept of risk and risk management, and they needed to embrace it more and get a better understanding of it. So, regulators, whether they're credit unions or charities, all have this desire to improve and support the organizations themselves in terms of improving their understanding and their management of risk. Okay, so we're coming now to the first essentials. So I'm going to cover 7 of these here. So a little bit of background we've had up to now, but I'm going to cover the 7 essentials now. And the first of those is to know your risks. So there's a process for that. So your organization, in whatever part of the charitable sector or not-for-profit sector that it is, will have certain risks facing it. And the risks you face may be different to the risks another charity just beside you in the same street across the road could face, because of the nature of how you trade, the nature of your business, the nature of the beneficiaries, the nature of the sector you're in, your funding structure, etc. So it's useful to take, and I'll show you a process for bringing those risks into your organization. But it is important that you individualize it and that you personalize it to your organization and you look at it from lots of different perspectives. So first step there, I'm saying identify the risks for your organization under this essential 1 about it, knowing your risks. Secondly, seek different views and perspectives. So some organizations do a little bit of a team exercise where they all sit down and say, what are the risks that we face? And in the old days, maybe little yellow stickers up on a flip chart or whatever. But whatever way you do it, it is important that you embrace a broader understanding and a broader knowledge of the risks that your organization faces. The second part, or the third part there, to categorize the risks. And I'll show you why that's important in a few moments, because risks there's a lot of them. And if you again go onto the internet and start searching for risks and risk categories, umpteen versions of them. I'm going to show you one version, which is a sort of an industry standard, and you can use that as a starting point if you haven't got as far as identifying and categorizing your risks. So we look at that. And then approve your risks. So I say approve your risks on the basis that charity boards have responsibility for risk management. That's where the control and the management and the responsibility sits. So it sits on a charity board shoulders and every trustee on that board to understand, manage, and control the risks. So this first part is knowing them, getting them approved. So let me show you what I mean by that. So this is quite a busy slide, so but I'm going to put it up here. So in a simple diagram here, I want to explain the nature of and a little bit of complexity of risks and how they affect charitable and other not-for-profit organizations like yours. So in a simplistic diagram, a not-for-profit body, charity, has beneficiaries, has impacts, and they're funded. However they're funded, could be partly from trading, from social enterprises, from grants, from donations, from subscriptions or whatever, lots of different ways of funding. But in a simple term, in a simple structure of an organization, that's how it looks. And when you bring the risk framework to that scenario for the voluntary board, and I'll put these up. Health and safety is a risk, social media, key staff, succession risk, financial risks, data protection, GDPR, credit risks, particularly if you're in a credit union which lends money to its members. You have legal and regulatory risks, overseas, government, cyber risk, reputation, strategic, supplier, currency, and last but not least, pandemic risk. I'm sure I don't need to remind everybody about the pandemic risk, which we're still finding our way out of at the moment after 18 months and more, actually, of this, actually coming on for 2 years, if you look at it from January last year. So basically, this landscape, if you like, is how risks affect, and I haven't even put them all up there, I've just put a selection of risks up there that a standard charitable organization may face in its running its business and operating. And the point of putting them up there is to show that there's a whole variety of them. But the way I've set them up there, the bulk of the ones on the left-hand side are internal risks, and the bulk of the ones on the right-hand side are external risks. So there's already a way to sort of categorize them and look at that. Now, they're not quite as categorical as that. They're not all internal and all external, because risks do overlap a little bit. So really important that you understand at least there's a lot of risks out there. These are just some sample of the risks. And if you were starting to analyze your risk framework or the risks that your charity might face, then this isn't a bad starting point. And when you impose on that the organizations that are external to the organization, the regulators, the donors, the funders, government, the public support organizations, accountants, advisors, it's a busy landscape, and I put that up deliberately to show it is a busy landscape. So trying to segment it down, which is what I'm trying to do now in this webinar, and to show you, 7 key elements that you can pull together to maybe make this image a lot easier. So instead of all of the individual risks, and they're all over the place, bringing it down into a structure that you and your board can follow and understand, and your stakeholders and your staff as well, if you have staff. Okay, so that last slide was the risks, and if you remember from the one before, we looked at the risks, identifying them, and then categorizing them. So it is quite important, I think, for organizations to categorize the risks, because it simplifies them under bigger headings. And there's lots of ways of doing that. There are dozens of ways that you can pull your risks together and categorize them. But I'm bringing you one option here. And this one actually comes from Charity Commission, and you'll get it on the Charity Commission for England and Wales website. And they have identified 5 risk categories. So you can use that as a starting point, and I'll put those up for you now. The first one is governance risk, so corporate governance, really important aspect of running a charitable organization. And they put in some examples of this. So this is just a copy from the website, but I've done this rather than give you a whole brand new set of categories, which I could have done. But I've taken it off the website. You can find this afterwards. It's on the England and Wales website. I'm fairly certain there's one on the Northern Ireland website, and there probably is one on the Scottish regulators website. But either way, it doesn't really matter. If these headings or categories are ones that you feel you could use, then start with these. You may decide to amend the titles, and obviously you'll have different risks underneath the titles, but that's fine. This is a starting point for you to consider the risks that your organizations face. So under governance risk, inappropriate organizational structure, trustee body lacks relevant skills or commitment, conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest was the topic of our first free webinar last month, and it's a really important aspect, and one that gets into the public domain, and to show you how these can overlap. A conflict of interest that goes wrong in a charity can in itself create a reputational risk for the charity. So there's linkages here. They're not all just necessarily in silos, but this is a starting point. So a conflict of interest that goes wrong, where some member of the board, gives preference to his supply company in doing something, and that gets out and stakeholders hear about that and donors and members hear about that. That in itself can cause a reputational risk for the organization, and that is a separate risk, but also needs to be recorded in your risk register, and we talk about that. And they're linked because the reputational risk, which the organization may face, can be mitigated by having a conflicts of interest policy in place that sets out exactly what are conflicts of interest and having a register of interest among members. So members actually have to register what their interests are, and they have to declare those at the start of every meeting. And if that happens, that would reduce the chances of something like a conflict of interest becoming a problem for an organization. So enough of that. We did that at the last webinar. The second heading that the Charity Commission uses is operational risks. So, and they've identified some examples of operational risk, like a lack of beneficiary welfare or safety, poor contract pricing, staff recruitment, doubt about the security of assets. So they're just a small sample, but they're to give you a prompt and to give you a suggestion as to the types of operational risks that your organization could face. Financial risks, really important, a separate heading for those, obviously. So inaccurate and or insufficient financial information. I think that is a key issue. I'm working with a couple of boards at the moment to help them to improve the quality of the financial information they get. They are getting financial information, but the quality of it isn't great. They're not really seeing the key financial information that their organization needs, or that the board of that organization needs to see to help it to run effectively. So I'm helping them just to improve that. And I think that that's an important, and will actually be a separate webinar. I'm going to do one on that separately, on financial information, financial management, financial reporting, because I think it's really important that the organization looks at the right financial information to help it to make the right decisions. And that's all, again, within the context of an effective board. Second bullet point, I'm not going through each of these here, but you can see the headings there: inadequate reserves and cash flow. So reserves are an issue for organizations, and particularly over the pandemic. I'm aware that many charitable organizations had to dip into the reserves. In fact, many would have had to use up their reserves, and I'm sure many organizations didn't have any, or many, or much reserves to cope with the pandemic. And the government did, through various initiatives, produce opportunities for additional grants and funding to be made available to charities and private sector companies to help them to overcome that problem. So that's a third risk category. So two more to go. Number 4, external risks. So poor public perception and reputation, demographic changes such as an increase in size of the beneficiary group. So changing government policy. Some of these risks are, they're not controllable in the sense that you can't eliminate them. So you can't eliminate government policy. If government policy changes and it affects your organization, you just have to try and work a way to fix that. And that should be in your risk register, that you've got mitigants as in how you might, if there's a policy in place that your organization benefits from, and it might change in your risk register, you should have that down as a risk and say, do you know what, if that does happen, here's our plan to move out of it. And I'll take you through the risk register process and how to record that. External risks, I'll just mention that first, from the poor public perception and reputation. I'm not sure if you saw the news this morning or heard the news this morning. It's I think the London Science Museum. They had a sit-in, I think, last night. I haven't heard the full details, but a sit-in last night that the people were protesting the climate change. A group were protesting about the London Science Museum taking donations and funding from fossil fuel organisations like Shell, I think BP, where they're taking in funding to help their organisation, and the climate change people feel that that's inappropriate. I'm not here to comment on that. I'm just laying it out there that the issue that causes internally and externally is a problem for the reputation of that organisation, and it's something that they will have to manage. I'm guessing and hoping that they would have had that in their risk register, and they would have been managing that risk, because they would have decided to take the funding from those organisations, and they would have decided that if something goes wrong with that, here's what we need to do about it. So again, I'll take you through that process. So the fifth one is compliance with the law and the regulations. So issues are like acting in breach of trust, not understanding your regulatory requirements. So that's an area, and the bulk of the mitigations for that in terms of how would a board overcome those will include things like training for the board, appointing people in charge of these issues, doing research into what the compliance and the regulations are. I mean, every charity has annual reporting requirements to the Charity Commission in terms of annual returns and changes to individuals, etc. So all of those things need to be managed, and the risks of something going wrong with those needs to be managed as well. So that hopefully will give you an idea of how to take that chart that I showed you there, slide with all the different risks in it, and maybe bring them down into something a bit more manageable in terms of categorizations. So you can bring each of those out of those headings, or you can set up your own headings. You can decide that you want a different mix of headings, or you want to merge some of these or whatever, entirely up to you, depending again probably on the size of your organization. And in fact, you don't even need to categorize them. If you're a small organization, maybe no staff, maybe only a small number of board members, you may just decide to list the 10 risks that you've got that you believe are there, and you don't necessarily want to categorize them. Again, that's okay. The point is you need to have a system. You need to have something, and that should be in your risk policy, which is where we're going next. So the risk policy, and going back to the little poll I did at the start, it seems that about, maybe, well, certainly less than half of the participants in the webinar have a risk policy in place. I would encourage you, when this webinar is over, to go out and develop a risk policy. Now, when I say risk policy, it doesn't have to be pages and pages and pages of stuff, but it has to be a policy on how your organization looks at, considers, and manages risk. And I'll tell you a little bit about what goes into that. So it contains the nature of the organization, the sector, your attitude to risk. So what risks you're prepared to take, what risks you're not prepared to take, the sectors that you don't want to go into, the areas that you feel are your organization is vulnerable to if you do go into them. So it's really it frames the organization in terms of how it wants to approach risk. And that's a document that's shared among all of the board. If you have staff, senior management, and in fact, all of the staff all can see that. And indeed your stakeholders as well. So funders, donors, if they ask for your copy for your risk policy, you can share it with them and say, here's how we manage risk. Here's our policy. Here's how we go through it. So the policy itself then contains the organization name, the sector, the details, the attitude to risk, the risk categories. I'll talk a little bit about those as well, and the approval date and review date. So the policy, if you have a risk policy in place, it needs to be reviewed regularly. Now, how often is regularly? Larger organizations, I would be thinking every year. Smaller organizations, maybe every 2 to 3 years, that sort of time frame, signed off and approved by the board. So really, it's a moving thing, and the Charity Commission goes into that as well. Charity Commission goes into the detail of the policies they need. And risk management is a moving feast. It really is something that needs to be kept under control, be kept managed, to be looked at regularly. It's not a static thing. You don't develop a risk policy, put it in place and say that's also the way to go. It's an ongoing process. Okay, so the risk policy provides a framework for managing risk in your organization. So that's your starting point, really. After you've identified the risks, the starting point of getting it into your organization is developing a risk policy. I put up a link there to the DIY committee guide. You may have come across that. It's a place you can go to for some free resources, really. So it's a place you can go to. I was looking for a risk policy on the website, and I was going to share it with that link. But the link is broken on the website when I looked for it. But there are other places you can get a template for a risk policy that you can take and retabulate it or formulate it into something that fits and suits your organization. So risk policy, really important. Identify your risks, categorize them, form a risk policy. That's essential 2. Essential 3 is setting up a risk register, and this is a core part of managing risk. I was going to ask a question as well as to whether you have a risk register in place. If you don't have a policy, you probably don't have a register, but you may have a register. So the register is just somewhere where you record it. So a risk register or a risk log, interchangeable words. that's where you actually record the risks. So somewhere where you write them down and say, this is the risk, and here's how it arose, and here's how you manage it, etc. And there's 4 stages to that in a risk register, and I'm going to take you through those. The first one is risk identification. The second one is risk analysis. Then there's risk planning, and then risk action. So those 4 stages in a risk register are really important. This is an extract from a risk policy, and it's linked to the risk register. And it's a little grid, and you may be familiar with it. And there's also a version of this on the Charity Commission's website, so you can see it yourself, you can copy it and use it. But this grid is a way to take a risk management identification process, and which is perhaps a little bit qualitative, so it's about words and risks and things that might happen, and make it into something quantitative, so you can actually score it. So it's a scoring process for your risks that you can use. Now, the one I've chosen here is just an example. I've seen these risk matrices, which I call them, in having just maybe 3 categories on either scale. Let me just take you through that. So you've got the x-axis on the right-hand side, the impact. So the risk impact, and on the top axis, the probability. So the probability of a risk happening is something you would quantify, in this case, on a scale of 1 to 5. So if you decide it's 5, which is high probability, and you say, well, if it did happen, what would be the impact in our organization? And then you decide, well, that would be quite serious if that would happen. So if that was 5, and the impact, the probability was 5, and the impact was 5, you multiply the 2 together, and you get 25 as a score. Top right-hand side, a red box. So that's a way to take your risks that you've identified and try to score them and understand what the probability of it happening and the impact. And this is a standard way that organizations manage their risk processes. And you can see the colors in there. The reds are red for avoid, avoid or eliminate. That's the typical action. The ambers are mitigates, which are things you can do about it. You can try to fix it or put in place some process to transfer there, or transfer, that's the next one, but to reduce the risk, lessen the risk in your organization. And the ones that are low risk, which are low probability, low impact, you can assess as green. We can sort of accept those, as an organization, because, the chances of that happening are pretty low. The impact of it having, if it did happen, very low. So we don't need to worry too much about those. And this is why risk oversight needs to be an ongoing process, because the risk that was maybe acceptable last year, maybe a risk that isn't acceptable next year. I don't think pandemic risk would have been very high on many organizations 2 years ago. I guess it's extremely high in many organizations now in terms of how they would react to a further future, here help us, pandemic, if something happened again, or a lengthening of the current pandemic process. So that little grid, again, is on the Charity Commission's website. You can find it, or a version of it. They have a different formula that they've used, but I've kept this quite simple in terms of probability, impact, multiply one by the other, get a final score. And that transfers into the risk log, and I'll show you that. So just before I look at that risk log, I just want to mention Essential 4, and this is developing your risk procedures. Now, this is slightly different to the policy. So policies are policies approved by the board. Procedures are actually how you implement the policies. And I think many organizations don't distinguish enough between those two. But I put it in as an essential, because I think that it's important that you develop your risk procedures. So in other words, you've got a policy, but how do you actually implement that in the organization? How does that work? How does it happen? How did you get that to make it actually work and people know about it and it's recorded and it's an ongoing process? So I suggest it should be an addendum to the risk policy. So it's policy formulated, and then at the end of it, here's how we do this in our organization. It will include things like the forms that you use to register a risk. It might include who's responsible for it, if there's an individual responsible for it, or a role that's responsible for it, or a subcommittee may well have responsibility for that. And I might outline the responsibility of the subcommittee in terms of how this is done and how often they look at it and how often they report on it. We'll look at when and how staff are trained on it, so how our staff and even board members trained on risk and how they understand it. So if you bring all this into your organization, you don't have a policy, you don't have a register, how will you tell people about it? So if you bring it in, how will you explain it to everybody? So that can find its way into the procedures as opposed to the policy itself. And who will operate and control the risk management system. So really, who's responsible for it? It could be an individual, it could be the CEO, it could be a board member if you've got no staff, and really that's where that's detailed. So essential for really important element, I think, just to make sure that there's a taking of your policy and a looking at, well, how do we actually do that? And how and when will reporting happen? So I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And reporting does need to happen on a regular basis to the board. So I'll move on to that. Okay, so the managing your risks. So these are the actions you can take to manage your risks. So these are just summarized as avoid. You can avoid your risk entirely or eliminate it. You can transfer your risk. Transferring a risk, for an example, I'll talk a little bit some of the mitigants later on. For instance, if you've got a building that there's a danger of fire or flood or something happening to it, you would get it insured. And that transfers the risk of that to an insurance company, and you pay a premium for that. So that's a way of managing the risk that something happens to your building. That's a simple way to explain a transfer of risk. You can mitigate the risk, so you can reduce or lessen it, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Or you can accept the risk. So some risks you just have to accept because there's nothing you can do about them, entirely outside your control. Whether the probability is high or low, or the impact is high or low, you just have to accept the risk because you can do nothing about that risk. And you just have to accept that that's there when you go into maybe a new program or something that it's just there. Okay, so I'm going to look now just under the managing your risks heading in Essential 5. I'm just going to look at the risk register and risk law or risk log and what it looks like. So if you remember the little boxes I had on a couple of slides ago, so step 1, identification, step 2, analysis, step 3, planning, and step 4, action. So that's how the risk log could look like. And this risk log or risk register that I've got here is just a sample. There's lots of versions out there. This is just one that I've used before and I've seen other boards use. There is a version of it as well on the Charity Commission website, and there's lots of versions and templates out there you can look at. You may not want one as comprehensive as this, or indeed you may want something even more comprehensive, because risk management systems out there are more embracing than just a register. They actually have systems built into them where there's email reminders sent to people, and there's priorities given, and there's reports are produced from them, etc. But in terms of keeping this essential, or keeping this simple today in terms of the essentials, I'm showing you a very basic risk register or risk log. And this is what it looks like. So go on the left-hand side. In this particular case, I've identified 2 risks. One is succession, and the other one is reserves. So you can see under each of the risk type under identification, if you just move across the right-hand side, the risk type is succession, and the description or source of that is that there's a skills gap on the board. So really, the board is missing some skills, and there's a need to maybe look at those. Could be IT skills, cyber skills, funding skills, finance, legal, or whatever, something that's missing on the board. And it comes under the category governance, which we looked at earlier. This assessment process has identified the probability of that happening is 2, so not quite high because there's maybe a good mix, but maybe a little bit of a gap. The impact is 3, again, not too serious, but still when you multiply one by the other, you get a score of 6, which is amber, which is in the medium side, in that little grid that I showed you before. And the response type under planning, that last bit there was the analysis of it. The planning bit then is the response type is to mitigate that. So what are we going to do about the fact that we have a skills gap on the board? It's a succession risk and it's in governance category, and we've given it a score of 6. Well, we're going to mitigate that. We're going to place an ad and we're going to fill that skills gap. So we're going to identify the fact we need a finance person or cyber risk person or an IT skills person on our board, and we're going to identify that and put an ad out and get somebody in. That's how we're going to mitigate that risk. That's recorded in your register. So the risk management plan is to place an ad and fill the gap. The owner of that is BF, Brian, somebody, or Bernadette, or Bridie, whatever it is. And that's who's obviously going to identify the person who's responsible for it. A target date at the end of March. And the residual risk is 4. So the residual risk is a way to say, look, we have a risk of 6, but if we do this and we place the ad and we get that gap filled, we think the residual risk after this is all done is 4. and it's going to be acceptable. We're okay at that level because we think a 4 is okay. So we're going to get it down from 6 to a 4. Again, not every risk register has that residual risk in, but I put it in just so I can explain that to you. And again, if you have an automated risk management system, it isn't on, this would typically be on a spreadsheet or a Word document. You may have a risk management system that's, I say a little bit more complex, maybe for a more complex organization, and you might have all that built into it. And then there's an action bit at the far side there where the ad is signed off. As in, this is where it is at the moment. The ad has been signed off. We haven't filled it yet, and the review date for that is the end of December. So that's an example of how you would fill in a risk register, or how somebody in your organization would fill in a risk register. I'm looking through the second one there. That's another example. You can have a look at that later. Just that's a reserves identification. I've left out some of the sections blank if you wanted to have a look at that and sort of fill them in yourself as an example. So, okay, that's essential 5. So risk mitigants, just to go through those again, in terms of the examples of mitigants that you can use. So an approach, mitigating a risk is an approach really that lessens the impact of that risk. So it reduces the chance of that risk actually happening. So the examples of those include the risk of a fire, as I said earlier, an insurance policy, there's a skill deficit, recruitment plan, loss of a key person, a comprehensive succession plan, down to the bottom, a pandemic, you get a contingency plan going. So there's ways you mitigate that risk. When you identify that as an organizational risk for you, you then look at a process whereby you can lessen that risk and break it to something that's more acceptable for you. And that's the management process, taking it from finding out what it is, recording it, looking at what you can do about it, and actually doing something about it. That's the process. So essential 6 is reporting your risk. So this is really what I mentioned earlier in terms of the Charity Commission. So this is external reporting where you're required to report. So the charities that are required to be audited must include a risk management statement in your annual accounts. And I think I mentioned this earlier, the smaller charities are encouraged to make a risk management statement as a matter of good practice. So reporting externally is really important, compulsory in some cases and best practice in others. So that's essential that you understand whether you as an organization have to report your risk, as in it's mandatory, or whether it's something that is best practice. And you need to decide as a board or as an organization whether you want to be operating best practice or not operating best practice. And you know what I'm going to say, best practice is at least what you should be aiming for. And a lot of the requirements from the Charity Commission in terms of whether you meet their requirements or not is along this comply or explain. So you either comply with what they think you should do or you explain why you don't. And that's an area that would be important. They say, look, we think you should have a report in your accounts about risk. You say, well, I'm not going to do that. Well, why not? You have to have an explanation as to why not. Okay, so yeah, number 7, embedding risk management. So we're one of the last of the 7, embedding risk management. So we're nearly at the end, about 6 minutes to go. So this is about embedding risk management in your organization. And I think this is one of the most important elements of the whole process. Certainly you need to get all of the first 6 all organized and in place. Once you get that far, you then need to think about taking it to the next level, which is to embed risk management. And I think that is an area that most boards struggle with. They struggle to embed it. They might have a register, they might have a policy, they might have procedures, but it's sometimes a little bit hit and miss. So this is my suggestions as to what things any board or organization should think about in terms of embedding it in your organization. So approve the risk policy and the risks themselves and the procedures that sit behind it. Tell staff about it if you have staff. Certainly make sure on the board understands the risk management process. So that the staff could include presentations, meetings, training, things like that. Because if a risk occurs in an organization, it's important that all staff know what they're meant to do about that. So what form do they fill in? Who do they tell? How do they record that? Is it just a conversation or is it a piece of paper that's filled in? So all of that needs to be articulated clearly to make sure that it's embedded and people understand, hey, do you know what? I just saw the other day something happened. That could happen in our organization. Now, who do I tell about that and how do I go about it? Internal reporting quarterly to the board, I recommend that. So I recommend that there's a regular internal reporting process to the board, at least every 3 months. with the key risks, and that annually as well, I think that the board should review all of the risks in the organisation. They should take all the risks and go through them and make sure the scores are okay, look at the risk register and prioritise them and look and say, well, look, we've got all these risks, but we need to prioritise which one's high, medium or low that we need to address first or second or third, or in the next 6 months or the next 12 months or next 18 months. Because some of them could be longer term than others. Some could be very short term, immediate risks, need to be looked at now. Others maybe will be something that maybe we can postpone for a while because it probably won't happen to 2023 or 2024, change in legislation or something like that. Corporate governance there, just overall compliance. So risk management is a fundamental element of good risk management, is a fundamental element of good corporate governance. And I recommend that actually there's an effective board, proactive approach taken to that. So an effective board is one that has good corporate governance, good processes, good management, good impact, strong, secure, everything like that. And I think having an effective board is an important sort of overarching feature of a good framework for organizations to work within. And as I say, there will be a future webinar on that. Okay, so this is just a quick thing about broader governance framework. There's two approaches to risk in terms of this particular element. So you can take risk as a standalone, as I said earlier, or you can look at it in a broader context. And I think taking it in the broader context is actually more important. So if it's a piecemeal, fragmented, standalone, let's deal with risk, let's get it sorted, and let's get it. From today onwards, you maybe will do that, but think beyond that in terms of how you will bring risk within the overall context of your governance and your effectiveness framework. And that's the second approach, I believe, and the one that most organizations should be aiming for in terms of best practice. So review risk and governance more broadly, review the areas of prioritizing, benchmark against best practice, and consider in the context of an effective board. And just for completeness, the effective board bit, which is a teaser for probably a future webinar, but I believe there's 7 key elements to an effective board, and organizations should be reviewing their effectiveness at least annually. That's best practice, and an external evaluation every 3 years. And I know smaller organizations will say, oh, no, we can't do that and we can't afford that in our resources. Again, best practice. If you don't get external reviews, you should have some internal review process to do that. There are some online or some checklists you can get for doing that. I'm actually developing an online version of this here for organizations that they can go in online and do this self-assessment, self-diagnostic on an individual basis, and they can take it through as a collective for the board and establish where they are against what I call the 7 headings. So the board roles and responsibilities, the composition and development, strategic leadership and performance, operating the board, and audit, risk and financial management, which is the topic of today. So risk that we've looked at today is an element of an effective board. And this is why I'm saying about taking a broader view of this here, about looking at it in the broader framework rather than just risk on its own. So that's one of the topics I believe, or one of the headings I believe that a board should assess itself in terms of how effective it is. Legal compliance and external relationships are the other 2 of the 7 that I recommend. Okay, quick summary, the 7 essentials we've looked at, because we're coming up to the time here. And we have the first step, which was to know your risks, identify them, find a way to explore with other individuals. Have you captured them all? And segment those as well, put them into categories, develop your risk policy approved by the board, add on to that your risk procedures as well, set up your risk register. Lots of templates out there that you can use. You can get some of this stuff from the Charity Commission website and from lots of other sources. You can develop your risk procedures, again, link to your policy there. Manage your risks, so that's through the risk management or risk register or risk log, or through a more comprehensive risk management system. And there are businesses out there that sell those to private sector boards and not-for-profit boards, and that it's a process. But you tend to need a member of staff who's going to manage that. So if you don't have staff, it's going to be difficult to have that operating. But if you're a big organization, you may already have that in place, or maybe considering it. Reporting your risks, the essential. It's important that you do that. And finally, embedding your risk management. So making sure that you get it embedded in your organization. So that's the 7 we've been through now. Yeah, that's a little bit about the tool that I'm developing, an online tool. It's going to be a process whereby the board will be able to complete a self-diagnostic against those 7 headings, against various benchmark standards. And that's coming next month. I'll have that next month. I'll let anybody know about that who's interested in it, if it's something you're interested in taking forward. And we are almost right on the dot of time. So thank you for your time. Managing risk essentials for voluntary boards was the topic this morning. Future topics: effective meetings for boards, financial management and oversight, and board effectiveness was self-diagnostic. So I'll be looking at those. Again, there'll be a mixture of live webinars and maybe recorded webinars, depending on what is the most appropriate, because I understand that some people, it's hard for them to break out the time during the day to come to these, but to be able to look at a recorded webinar might be a lot easier. And there we go. That's us. I was looking for Q&A. There were no questions came through there. See, there's a chat. Oh, thanks very much. Good presentation. Will I share the slides? Thought that was going. Yes, I will. I intend to, subject to me checking the quality of the webinar, I intend to share the webinar details, so you can actually review the webinar and you can actually see it and you can stop it, and take the bits from it. I'll be putting that up on a channel which you can access for free. There'll be any problems with that. So, but I just want to make sure that the quality of it is okay, and you'll be able to do that. If I can't do that, I will make sure that you get a copy of the slides and make sure everyone has a copy of the slides. I think I have your email details from the registration process, but I'll follow up with that. Okay, and yeah, I think that's lots of people thanking me there for that. That's great. Delighted to help. If you've any queries, I mean, my contact details are there, tony@admorebusiness.com. So if you want to follow up with me at some particular queries you have, or something that maybe wasn't quite clear today and you weren't willing to put up a question on it today, that's absolutely fine. You can contact me there or contact me through LinkedIn if that's something that's easier for you, or there's a Twitter, or you can sign up to my newsletters. Different things are different ways of contacting me. And if you want to, I'm more than happy to come back and give you a little bit of specialist direction if it's something that's particularly difficult for you, or you're maybe struggling as to how you'd apply to your organization. Happy to have a quick chat with you about that if that's suitable. Okay, folks, conscious of the time, 1 hour, bite-sized. So thanks very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Good luck. Bye-bye.